Welcome, everyone. If you're just coming in the back, you might like to take a seat. And I'd like to welcome a special guest today. So we have Professor James Hoffmeier from, Wheaton College and then Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Illinois. And I think, as you've told me, just recently retired. Whatever that means. But Professor Hoffmeier is an Egyptologist known all around the world, dearly beloved among our community as the inventor of the 4 C's. We don't know if you invented them, but we think that you do because of your introductory archaeology textbook. So it's a really great privilege to have you here, brother, and have some face-to-face fellowship. So please welcome with me, Dr. Hoffmeier.
Well, good morning. Thank you for coming, although I understand it's a class, so some of you are stuck here. Apologies for that. What does it mean to be retired? It means I don't have to grade papers anymore, which is really wonderful. Although just yesterday I sent off an 85-page chapter of a dissertation back to the student I'm working with, so a few more dissertations and no more papers, I hope. Well, my subject today, maybe it was advertised, I don't know, but we titled the lecture Akhenaten, Moses and the Origins of Monotheism. And this talk is really something of a summary and really a very hurried summary of my book, Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism, which has been out for a couple of years now. So anything I don't have time to say today, maybe the library has it and you can borrow it. If you really want to become a friend, buy it. I have 3 and almost 4 grandchildren I need to spoil, so all the royalties are appreciated. So, there's been a big debate in Egyptological circles and amongst historians of religion as to whether Akhenaten was a monotheist, and if so, was he the first monotheist? Now, of course, some of you will scratch your head and say, well, surely Abraham was before that, and what about Moses? We'll come back to Moses at the very end of the talk, but I want to talk about Akhenaten first, and I can do this lecture as I did in Adelaide night before last to a completely secular, non-theological group, and it's of course a question of interest for simply from the history of religion or the history of ideas. When you think about monotheism as a religious way of thinking that is so influential upon the Abrahamic religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, it has certainly been something that has shaped the Western tradition. And so this is a point of interest, whether or not you're a Christian, a believer, or studying theology. So was he a monotheist? And I'll go into the data that would suggest that he was, but I will argue that Akhenaten was a monotheist, to which you might say, so what? But let me define monotheism. And anytime you talk in such terms, it really is important to make sure you have a definition that is relevant and workable. So I would define monotheism, this is not exclusively my definition, but monotheism is defined as the exclusive worship of one deity and the denial of the existence of other deities. There is a stage of religious experience called henotheism. Those of you studying Greek know heno, one God. And why is that different than monotheism? Well, the 2 words mean the same thing. One happens to be Latin, mono, the other Greek. So what's the difference? Really is no difference except how the word is used by historians of religion. And henotheism represents a lot of people are henotheists today. That is to say, I believe in God or even goddess X, you believe in God or goddess Y, and that's great. I only worship one, and you can worship a different deity. That's henotheism. And some would say Abraham was a henotheist. The patriarchs are henotheists. When you get to Moses and you get to later in Old Testament history, it's a different ball game, as we would say in the States. Deuteronomy 7, when you go into the land, what do? You knock down their altars, you destroy their statues, etc. Nothing else is allowed to exist. And so we might at this point say, as our Muslim friends would say, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God. The German Egyptologist Erich Hornung properly defined Akhenaten's religion by saying, there is no God but Aten, and Akhenaten is his prophet. Now, the biblical prophets speak in such terms as Isaiah, who would say, I am the Lord, and beside me there is no Savior, or the words of Hosea, I am the Lord your God, beside me there is no Savior. This idea of exclusivity, there is none beside me. That's monotheistic statement. Now, I'm going to call Akhenaten's religion Atenism. This has been around a long time, since probably the very early part of the 20th century. I don't know if it was Sir E.A. Wallace Budge who dubbed it or not. But what we'll see is that Akhenaten's religion actually went through a number of phases over a period of 5 to 7 years. So in the earliest stages of Akhenaten's religious experience or reforms, I think it's fair to say he was not a monotheist. But by the 9th year of his reign, certainly by the 9th year of his reign, he was a monotheist. And he only reigned for 17 years, or into his 17th year. Let me put Akhenaten in his historical context very briefly. He is in what we call the New Kingdom, and then more specifically the 18th dynasty. And this dynasty was founded around 1540 by the pharaoh Ahmose. And his successors built a vast empire that stretched from the central part of what is today Sudan and north all the way to and sometimes across the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. So Egypt controlled a vast empire, and it became very wealthy. Amenhotep III, who is the father of Akhenaten, enjoyed the great riches of the empire his predecessors had built up. Akhenaten made everything on a huge scale, huge statues, huge temples. Things were going great. The empire was under control. In fact, some refer to this as a Pax Aegyptiaca, a period of peace and prosperity and unity, et cetera, et cetera. And along comes his son Amenhotep, who will be Amenhotep IV. And he will later change his name to Akhenaten. And those are his years, 1353 to 1336. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll talk a little bit about his successors afterwards, but when we come to the end of the 18th dynasty, around 1300 BC, by that time, Akhenaten's religion is gone. As you will see, it's a brief blip on the radar screen of history. Now, back up a little bit. Around 2000 BC, there were two very dominant religious powers at work in Egypt. Amongst the myriad of gods and goddesses that were worshipped, but there were two very important centers for the gods, both the sun god in the north, and the name you see on the map there is Heliopolis, city of the sun, which today is actually a suburb of Cairo, still called Heliopolis. Here, the sun god, whose cult goes back to the 3rd millennium BC and maybe even earlier, represents one very important dynamic, and the other in the south, way down near the bottom of the map at Thebes and Karnak Temple, is the god Amun. Now, the sun god, and the sun god will be Akhenaten's deity, that'll be the god he focuses on, has a long prehistory. In other words, Akhenaten is not an inventor of something new per se. The sun god is sometimes known to us by different names. Most prominently, Re seems to be a generic term because Re also means day. You can use the word Ra-Neb every day, as well as Ra meaning the god. And primarily, the cult center at Heliopolis is called Atum. That's the name by which he's known, Atum. And As far as we know, this goes back before 3000 BC. Now, interestingly, the Egyptian name for Heliopolis, and by the way, that's the name in the Septuagint, okay? Everybody knows the Septuagint? In Hebrew, the place is called On, and it is here where the sun god had his primary temple. And interestingly enough, in the book of Genesis, we find Joseph marrying the daughter of the priest of On. So Joseph's father-in-law was a pagan priest of the god Atum of Heliopolis, interestingly enough. And the name of the temple, the cult center of this god, was called Hut Ben. And Hut, I know it sounds like you're having a great time, but it really means a mansion or the dwelling of the Ben. And we'll talk about what the Ben is in a moment. It was my son's nickname growing up because his name was Benjamin, so we had fun with that. Not so much anymore. He's well into his 30s, but in any event, from about 2400 BC on, all the pharaohs were called the son of Re. The pharaoh was an incarnation of the sun god, and hence the title son of Re, son of the deity. The Ben stone really is the cap of the pyramid. The very top of a pyramid, or the top of an obelisk, is a Ben stone, and that was the sacred image of the sun god. In addition to the pyramid, the Sphinx, that is so well known to all tourists who visit Egypt, is also associated with the sun god. We know this from texts that talk about the Sphinx. And for the period roughly 2400 to 2300, there was a brief phenomenon of a temple that Egyptologists creatively call sun temples, with a Ben stone as the primary focus. And unlike the pyramids that were used for burial purposes, these were cultic in nature. So offerings were made here, sacrifices were brought here, etc. And so these may have been replicas of the Hut Ben temple in Heliopolis or On. But these were found close to the Great Pyramids. None of these have actually survived. Fragments of them are available in like the Berlin Museum, some of the reliefs, but by and large they're destroyed and have not survived. But anyway, all these are symbols we come to associate with the sun god. Now, Amun was a different bird. He is always portrayed in human form, or almost always. If he is associated with an animal, it's a ram. A ram. Which is very interesting because, sorry, this is a little excursus footnote, but you might find interesting. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, there was a large Jewish community living on Egypt's southern frontier after the fall of Jerusalem. And they hovered around the island of Elephantine and Aswan, and they had a temple of Yahweh there. It's actually been found. And on the other side of the wall was the temple of the god Khnum, who, like Amun, is depicted as a ram. Now you can imagine the riot this caused when the Jews were celebrating Passover. Anyway, but I'll just dangle that out there for another talk sometime. But this is the god Amun, typically shown in human form, but sometimes associated with a ram. He is sky. If he's painted, he's blue. He is the sky, he's hidden. His name Amun means the hidden one. And he's not very well known, and his origins are a bit murky, but you noticed in the 18th dynasty, all these pharaohs named Amun-hotep. Amun is satisfied. And we can go back to about 2000 BC for the first time and see pharaohs with the name Amun-emhat. Amun is foremost, and so it goes. So he has his origin somewhere before 2000 BC, becomes very important, and then something interesting happens around 2000 BC. There's one of the greatest corporate mergers in history. Amun and Re are very judiciously brought together to form a new god, sky and heaven and sun together, known as Amun-Re. And this little chapel at Karnak Temple celebrates this god Amun-Re, a synthesis of these two very powerful deities, which probably was done for political reasons to unite Egypt after political disruption of the first intermediate period, and so religion was used to help unite a country that had been fragmented by civil war. So the god of the north, god of the south, boom, bring them together. Okay, so all of that is background too, and by the time we get to Akhenaten, the god Amun-Re was unquestionably the head of the pantheon. In fact, he's called the king of the gods. He's top dog. That's if you're dyslexic. Top god. Anyway. Now, who is this Akhenaten? I show you these pictures intentionally because most people are familiar with these very bizarre-looking pictures of him, which usually are on the cover of books like mine, where he's got the strange protruding chin, he's got skinny little shoulders but big hips, very strange bird in many ways. Why he's portrayed this way is a puzzle. We know his father. His father is Amenhotep III, the very powerful ruler who reigned for 38 years, and his mother was the lovely and gracious, very influential Queen Ti, or Tia, depending on who you're talking to. Very good roots this man has. Interestingly enough, he was not the heir apparent. He had an older brother named Thutmose, depicted here, who, had he become king, would have been Thutmose V. Well, we don't know what happened for sure, but we do know that he died as a young prince, and we see him here on the funerary bier, dead, and we know he's still a prince. Right here you can see the title Sanesu, son of the king, and his name there, Thutmose, and he's laying there prepared for burial. So sadly, young Prince Thutmose dies, leaving yet younger brother to take over when dad died, probably at around age 60 or thereabouts. Now, Amenhotep IV, and that's his name when he becomes king, he'll become Akhenaten a few years later, but he starts out as Amenhotep IV. Amen is satisfied. That's what Hotep means. Our first portrayals of this king, he looks just like any Egyptian pharaoh. In fact, looks a lot like dad here. He's made in his dad's image. But here he is, newly minted king, sitting on the throne, looks very normal. He's even portrayed on one of the gateways or pylons of Karnak Temple as a pharaoh smiting the heads of his enemies, and very muscular looking guy, not those skinny girly man arms that he has later on. This is one of the first times we find this king in an attitude of worship, and it is worth noting that the two deities he is presenting offerings to on the left is the god Ra Harakti, which means the sun Ra in his horizons. That's on the left. He has two little bowls in his hand. He's offering wine, and you might want to take this down. This may give you extra point on your test. The Egyptian word for wine is erp. I don't know why. Just think about it. Anyway, on the right, he is making a presentation to that god Atum of Heliopolis, Atum of On. So it's worth noting that the first time we do see him acting in a worshipful or a cultic capacity, it's both with sun-related deities. Now, whether that indicates a proclivity, I can't say for sure. The other interesting thing here is that standing behind him is his mom. Usually if a mother of a king is shown in a scene like this, it means one of two things. Either he's very young, or mom's very old and very important. In this case, this is the beginning of his reign, so it suggests he was rather young, mid-teens, mid to late teens, and mom is still has an official capacity to help her son figure out the ropes. So that's worth noting. He does marry, and again, it's hard for us this day. My son just got married in July, and he's, 32, 33. People are getting married in 14, 15, very young in ancient times, as they do in many third world cultures, even today in the rural areas. But he marries probably in his early to mid-teens, late teens, the lovely, gracious Nefertiti, whose bust, famous bust is in the Berlin Museum. In fact, both of these are in the Berlin Museum. And she will be a very dominant presence in his life and mother at least 4 daughters for him. But I want to take you to the tomb of Ramosa. Ramosa was a prime minister under Dad, Amenhotep, and continued in his capacity as prime minister into the reign of Akhenaten. And this tomb has beautiful carved art on the walls, the kind of art that we see in the period of Amenhotep III. Then on the back wall of the tomb, we find something very different. This change in the style, I'll show you a drawing where you can see this better. And now we suddenly see Akhenaten and his wife, Nefertiti, and he starts to be portrayed with this protruding chin and suddenly looks very different. Now, it's pretty clear that at this point, this is probably year 2 or year 3 of his reign, and the reason is he's still called Amenhotep. But notice now, we begin to see the iconography that will become the dominant iconography throughout his life. That is the sun, with the rays of the sun pouring down, offering blessings and life to all who are below. There's his name, Amenhotep. Okay, so now we'll take a look at his god, which is an expression of the sun god. And it is hard for us to understand because from our monotheistic perspective, we don't grasp the ability of polytheists to have many different versions or aspects of the same deity. Now, maybe you recognize this in the Old Testament when you're reading along and you read about the different expressions of deity like Baal Berit, Baal, various aspects of the Baal gods, the storm gods of the Near East. But here is a poem from the reign of Ahmose, the founder of this dynasty, in which the king is likened to the sun. And we're told that he, the king, is beheld like Re when he rises, and then like the shining Aten, usually translates something like sun disk, like the appearance of Khepri, the one who comes into being, Khepr means, in the sight of his rays on high, like Atum, that's the sun god of Heliopolis, in the eastern sky. So here you see all these different terms for sun god all mushed together as if it's different aspects or manifestations of this one deity. For whatever reason, Akhenaten latches on to Aten. Maybe because there had been no specific Aten cult before this time, no specific iconography, but in any event, we do know that during the generations prior to Akhenaten himself, the god Aten was becoming more dominant. In fact, his father was really attached to the god Aten, or the expression of the sun called Aten. In fact, Dad called himself the dazzling Aten. His palace was called the Palace of the Dazzling Aten, and his boat that he traveled up and down the Nile in, if you will, I don't know what you have here, the American presidents forever have flown in Air Force One, okay? So think of Yacht One for the Egyptian pharaoh. Yacht One was called the Dazzling Aten. So it's clear Amenhotep III was really into the Aten himself. So much so that some have said, well, okay, look, all we have with Akhenaten is he just takes it one step further. He just goes a little bit beyond what his dad did. Another theory out there is that what Akhenaten is doing is he's created a cult to his deceased father, that the Aten really is a dead daddy cult, which not too many people are accepting, but it's out there based on the research of a very prominent scholar named Raymond Johnson. So in any event, these are at least two theories to try to explain what Akhenaten is doing. Let's look a little deeper into his god, and I'd like to show then how we move towards monotheism. Re-Herakti is depicted here. Notice he's a falcon-headed, just as we saw him in that first scene where wine is given to him. He has a sun disk on his head, and the dazzling rays shoot out from his head. Notice the sun disk overhead with, these are cobras, and around the neck of cobras is life, and there you have his name, Ra-Herakti. That is the sun in the two horizons There you go. Now, what you're looking at here is a block about meter, maybe meter and a half long in the Berlin Museum. If you like Akhenaten, if you like this Amarna period, Berlin is the place to go. The greatest collection of materials from this period anywhere in the world, much to the chagrin of our Egyptian friends. But this block shows his god, and here you can see him, just like the ones I've shown you, the sun disk on his head of a falcon, and we have his name, and it's a rather protracted long name, part of which is on the block above, but his name is written down there at the bottom, Re Harakti, who rejoices in his horizon, in his name of Shu, who is in the Aten. That's a long name. Can you imagine saying amen at the end of that? So that's his, some people call it theological name, or his didactic name. It's meant to instruct who this deity is. So he's Ra Harakti, who rejoices in the horizon in his name of Shu. Now, what do we know about Shu? Another block from this same temple was discovered in the 1850s. A copy was made, and the block proceeded to disappear. Nobody has seen it since 1850 something. All we have is the copy. But here we have that name of that deity again, Ra Harakti, who rejoices in his horizon. And to the right, we have a depiction of the god Shu. Shu is the primeval god, the first god created by the sun god. He is the atmospheric light. He is the space that holds up the heavens. And his wife is Tefnut. So here is a block from a temple, probably from the very first year of Akhenaten's reign. And not only do we have these gods presented, we also have the three hieroglyphs together, which is the plural for gods. So we could say at the beginning of his life, he clearly is not a monotheist, not even a henotheist. He's an outright, full-fledged polytheist. This large gateway that you can see through this in the background with the crane, as I've traveled around between Melbourne and Adelaide and now here, I think I've come to realize that the state bird of Australia must be the crane. I see these cranes all over the place. In any event, these building cranes are being used to dismantle this large gateway or pylon because it was falling apart due to some earthquakes. And what was discovered was inside the core structure were all these blocks that had been used to make a temple to this god Aten. By 1970s, over 40,000 of these blocks had been found at different places, reused. Egyptians were great recyclers. 40,000 blocks with inscriptions on them, not just blocks, but inscribed blocks. And often they would have a scene or a partial scene like this. We call them talatats. They're a distinctive size, basically 52 centimeters long by 26 by 24. 52 centimeters, that's the Egyptian cubit. My own professor, Dr. Donald Redford, was the one who was tasked with trying to pull all this material together and discover where they originally came from. Ironically, my professor has yet to retire, and I'm retiring. So anyway, here's a beautiful picture of a talatat block with workers carrying talatats. It's sort of like somebody with an iPhone taking a picture of somebody with an iPhone. But anyway, it does illustrate how these men were able to carry a single talatat on their shoulder and build. And it is reasoned that this allowed Akhenaten to build prodigiously. I mean, he built huge temples in very short periods of time. And the smaller stones seem to work a lot better than using the great big stone that took scores of men to move one block. Here's just some of the scenes of some that have been matched, but the vast majority have not been matched. And what Professor Redford ended up doing was working from photographs and wonderful giant jigsaw puzzles. And 2 volumes of these scenes have been published by Redford. I had the pleasure to do one of the chapters. But what we begin to see now from these later temples, and these later temples we'll talk about more in a moment, he built 4 of them. And we see the iconography that we've become familiar with. Some of the blocks show the king undergoing a Jubilee festival. The Jubilee festival normally takes place in the king's 30th year. It's a rejuvenation ceremony. Here he is at the beginning of his reign, or beginning of his career, 3 years into his reign, or 4 years, and he's celebrating the Jubilee, which is, what's going on here? You're not an old man yet. You're probably barely 20. What's going on? From these blocks, and here are more blocks showing him undergoing this ceremony, here are some match scenes. By this time, he has 3 daughters. That's what we figure. It's at least year 3, maybe year 4 at the latest. He has 3 daughters. Here's the procession with the king, the queen, the 3 daughters. This was put together by a National Geographic artist many years ago based on the scenes. Several things happened through this ceremony, and as I said, we have at least 4 temples that were built, one of which was for the celebration of this Jubilee. He changed his name. He now goes by Akhenaten. The name Amenhotep is dropped. In fact, when the temple started construction, his name Amenhotep appeared on some of the blocks. Then he had his workmen go around, chisel that out, and write in Akhenaten. So he changed his name in connection with the ceremony. In other words, embracing the name Aten and dropping the name of Amun. The second thing that happens is the name of his god now appears written in a cartouche using the same technique for a king. Kings write their names in these oval rings called cartouches, and now the god's name. Now this is not common. God's names are typically not written this way, but the signal is being sent that this king, or this deity, is now king. He's now at the top. So all this happens around year 3 of his reign. I'll just take you on a quick tour of back in the 1970s when we discovered this temple outside of what is today Karnak Temple. This is where some of the fragments of these great statues are found, some of which are in the Cairo Museum and the Louvre and different places. Very strange. There he is, a very strange look. This is our team in 1977. Yes, that's me on the right, about 25 kilos ago. And here we are digging on the outskirts of what was the Karnak Temple. You can see off in the background. And here we found the remains of the temple and where Akhenaten's statues were found. And here's just a plan. Let's move on quickly. That's me, the young photographer. But basically, what we came to realize was that this temple, thanks to the inscriptions and the scenes that were found, is where this Jubilee festival occurred. Here are more of these teletype blocks that were found some years later. I'm going to speed things up, but this is the data, and this is the result, okay? So down here at the bottom, the outline of the temple, and it actually goes beyond into the village off to the east. So some of the temple walls actually go under present-day houses. Now, look at that blue outline. It gives you a sense of the size of this thing. It was huge because at that time, this was the main temple of Amun that had been built over the years by many kings. And he builds a temple larger than the main temple built by his forebear Thutmose III. And we have blocks with the names of 4 different temples. Egyptians named everything. So each temple has a name. And the first one he built was called Hut Benben. Remember that name? Hut Benben was the name of the sun temple at Heliopolis. So he's clearly identifying himself with that old tradition, but meanwhile makes these other temples as well. Well, no sooner than the celebration is over, several things begin to happen in rapid succession. Number one, a program to eradicate the images and names of especially Amun and other deities begins. An iconoclasm, a purge, and you can go all over Egypt and you can see, like this, the image of Amun has been chiseled out. And often it's his name that's chiseled out. Even at the very top of this obelisk that stood 96 feet high, the image of Amun has been hacked out, and you can just see the white outline showing that. But then it was subsequently restored by a later king, probably Seti I. Over here you can again see the white because it was chiseled out, words spoken by Amun-Re. That was chiseled out and restored. Now that's going to great lengths to climb up on the top of obelisks to chisel out the names of this god. The temple of Amun was closed. All the priests were fired. I liken him to Ronald Reagan, who shortly after he became president, the air traffic controllers decided they wanted to go out on a strike, which was illegal in the States. And so Ronald Reagan says, fine, you're fired. He fired them all and hired more air traffic controllers. And so that's exactly what Akhenaten did. Okay, you're not going to work for me, you're all fired. And so the temple of Amun was closed, other temples were closed. He diverted all the resources from the temples to building his temples for his god. It's starting to look a little bit like an abandonment of the gods. Even in North Sinai, where I excavated, we found blocks. These are door jambs, and the name of Amun has been hacked out. And even in the cartouche, the name of the great-grandfather, Amenhotep II, the name Amun has been hacked out. This is in Sinai. I mean, from one end of Egypt to the other, somebody's going around chiseling out the names of this god. That looks very exclusivistic. This is a statue in Vienna of Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep, and a close-up of the name. You can see even Dad's name has been hacked out. Even as my dad, I can't handle the name Amun anymore. That's the extreme to which, and by the way, this is not the king himself right now. He has his soldiers and henchmen doing this. All right, what led to this? What led to an abandonment of the most prominent deity? And by the way, Jeremiah 2 asks the question, who ever heard of a nation that abandons their gods? This is not done. And of course, that's, we could say, out of Egypt. Who ever heard of such a thing? By the way, later generations will look back at this king and call him a heretic. We might think of him as a hero. He got the idea of one God. But anyway, what happened? What's behind this? My theory, and this really is what I tried to do that's different, and it really came about in the course of my research. I started, which probably is a very good sign, and hopefully you'll learn it too, is when you're doing research, you might start with a thesis. But as you start looking at the data, you say, it just doesn't go that way. It's leading me this way. And that's exactly what happened to me. In fact, I was so alarmed by the direction I was going, I finished this chapter, I sent it to 4 colleagues, one of whom is Boyo Akinga at Macquarie and several other scholars. I said, am I going nuts here? What do you think of this theory? And they all wrote back and says, it's brilliant, that makes sense. Anyway, so here's what they thought was brilliant. I suggest he had a Damascus Road experience, a conversion experience, a divine encounter, a theophany of some sort that sort of changed his perspective on things. What was that? I don't know. But we have several lines of evidence, which I don't have time to get into in detail, but there are 5 lines of evidence, one of which is the name of the temple that he built, that temple that I was involved in excavating as a young graduate student. The name of the temple is Gempa Aten. He built a new temple, I'll show you a plan of that, at Amarna, his new capital. He built a temple in Nubia by the same name, and it means something like the Aten is discovered. There's a sense of discovery, an encounter. And by the way, Hosea talks about how God discovered Israel in the wilderness. There's this element of surprise, just like finding grapes in the wilderness. You don't expect to find grapes in the wilderness. It's odd. So I think there's some sort of discovery. I don't know whether it was, he was blinded by the sun, who knows what. I'm just saying something happened. There are inscriptions that seem to suggest this. Very interesting. These blocks are still intact in a wall, and you can only partially see them. And Professor Redford crawled up and tried to copy the text and photograph them, but you can't see the whole thing, and part of it is blocked. But it basically depicts in words the god Ra-Harakti seated and making a proclamation. And in this proclamation, it refers to the gods, Abab is the word, have ceased. It's as if the gods have ceased to function, and this God is saying, I want you to make a temple of a God who is different. And this seems to be a reflection on this theophany. The king went mad making temples to this god all over Egypt, and all these lines represent places where temples, where blocks have been found. I learned just the other day that now also at Piramesi, the capital of the 19th and 20th dynasty, they found Telatat blocks reused. We found them out in Sinai. So what happens? Akhenaten abandons, if you think of Thebes as Vatican City for the Amun imperial capital. It would be like the Catholic Church moving from Rome and going to Geneva and starting all over again, or something like that. And this is what it does. He abandons the sacred city, the Vatican of his day, and establishes a new capital halfway up Egypt in a place called Amarna, and the new name of the city is called Aten. Around the city, he makes these markers to mark his new city, all of which have the sun god and him adoring the sun god. And even with the founding of this city, he makes, if you will, a confession of some sort of theophany, where he says, "Behold Aten, there's Aten." And he goes on to say about how Aten revealed to him a desire to have a new city built and new temples built, and that's what he does. This is the temple Gempa Aten. Remember that name? That was the temple we discovered at Karnak. Huge temple, 150 meters long. And look at the bottom, all those little squares are altars. 920 altars in that one field. Altars, all these little squares in the temple, these are altars. And on the north, more, not all of which have been uncovered, but Barry Kemp from Cambridge, who's excavating here, believes there were 1,700 altars, minimum. Guy's going nuts. What are you doing making so many altars? Talk about altar calls. Anyway, Barry Kemp himself says, surely it's a symptom of obsession. Why is he so obsessed with altar making? Now, read through your Bible and you will know that almost any time God appears, whether it's to Abraham or to Samson's parents or other stories in the Bible, I can show you stories outside of the Bible, the response is to make an altar and make an offering. Altar building and offerings are responses to theophany. And I think this is a tangible piece of evidence that he is responding to this encounter with this deity, which changed his life forever. And that's why he's always shown standing before an altar, piled high with food, offering to his God. Now, two more things, and we'll try to bring this to the end. The god has one more name change. And this name change occurs by his 9th year. And the name, I think, signifies any attempts to associate his deity with any other deities. So look at the new name. Instead of Ra-Harakti, who rejoices in his horizon, in his name of Shu, who is in the Aten, it now becomes Living Ray, the living sun, ruler of the horizon, rejoicing in the horizon, in his name of Ray, the Father, who has come literally or appears as the sun disk. Notice Shu is gone. We can't have that pagan element. Ra-Harakti is gone. We can't have that other deity associated. And all that is stripped, and we're simply left with the sun who manifests himself through the sun disk. And so what we see is, and by the way, oops, I've gone the wrong direction, sorry. I just wanted to show that picture once again, because what happens is from about year 5, year 6 on, never again do we even see his God portrayed as a falcon. The falcon is gone. The human figure, like with a sun disk on his head, that's gone. All you have is the sun itself. So what we might think of all the pagan elements are gone from the iconography. Now, lastly, in terms of, and I think the best theological affirmation of his view is found in a great hymn found on one of the tombs at Amarna, one of his priests named I. And this is a hymn that is said to be composed by Akhenaten himself. Splendid you rise in heaven's light land, O living Aten, creator of life. Earth brightens when you dawn in the horizon, when you shine as Aten of daytime. How many are your deeds, though hidden from sight? Now get this is the key line. O sole God, beside whom there is none. That's an exclusive monotheistic statement. And to be theologically consistent, if there's only one God, that God must be a universal God, not just a local God. So read on. The lands of Hor, Syria, and Cush, that is what is today Sudan, and the land of Egypt, they're all a part of his creation. So it's clearly a universal God. That's a logical conclusion of monotheism. And that line, O sole God beside whom there is none, is that there is no God but God. Okay, so I think, and if I had more time to develop it, we could make a very strong case for him being a monotheist. But the second, let me just wrap up those points. Other deities, especially Amun-Re, the previous head god, is persecuted and eradicated. We even have writings where the plural writing for gods is scratched out because that's no longer theologically viable. Other temples are closed, and we know this because later decrees, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment, his successors, King Tut, opens all the old temples and rehires all the fired priests who are still alive. Temples are built all over the place exclusively to this god. No temples built to anyone else. And it's this exclusive element that leads me to say he's a monotheist, not a henotheist. Okay, is there a connection to Moses? Well, I don't know if he was the first, but certainly one of the first to make this suggestion was none other than Sigmund Freud. He wrote a book which is still available. I think it's every now and then somebody reprints it. And it's called Moses and Monotheism, 1939. And the good doctor says, I venture now to draw the following conclusion. If Moses was an Egyptian, which I don't know, I would start with that assumption, and if he transmitted to the Jews his own religion, then it was that of Akhenaten, the Aten religion. So again, I don't know that he was the first. James Henry Breasted talks a little bit about it some years earlier, but he popularized the notion. Freud did. Because of who Freud is, a lot of people paid attention. But as most Egyptologists think, he should have probably stuck to psychoanalysis. Preferably the person sitting in front of him, not somebody from thousands of years earlier. Now, my conclusion is there is really no connection, and there are several reasons for that. Again, people differ on when the Exodus occurred. If you go with the so-called early date, then Akhenaten comes 100 years after Moses and the Exodus. If you believe in the late date or 13th century date, then it's not quite a century, but you're decades removed. In other words, Moses comes along well after Akhenaten. So there is a chronological issue. Secondly, there is a geographical issue. Once Akhenaten makes his new capital in Middle Egypt, everything seems to indicate that that's where he stays. He doesn't venture off all over Egypt. He doesn't have to. You see, pharaohs used to have to go to the different temples and show up to do their royal duty at different temples all over Egypt. There's only one temple that needs taken care of. He didn't have to go anywhere. He could stay put. And all the evidence seems to suggest that he bound himself to an oath to stay in his Vatican City. Moses, on the other hand, was in the land of Goshen, which is northeastern Egypt. The Bible also calls it the land of Ramesses, the northeastern delta. And if you read the Exodus narratives, it's that Moses gets up in the morning and boom, he's there in Pharaoh's court. He didn't take 3-4 days traveling to Amarna, where he could have hung out with Akhenaten for a while and had lunch. So that seems there's a geographical problem. Perhaps the biggest problem is that when Akhenaten died, so did his religion. This is his sarcophagus. It's located on the Nile side of the Cairo Museum. If you ever get to the Cairo Museum, go outside. There's no signs telling you where to go, but it's the one with the big sun disk and the rays on it. Okay, so it's around, if you're facing the museum, go around the left side, you'll see unless they move it to the new museum, but I don't think they are. But there it sits. When he died, his religion was lost. We know this on a number of levels. When he died, his reforms died with him. What you see on the right is the inscription left by Tutankhamun, one of his immediate successors. Might have been come along a couple years later. We don't know for sure if Queen Nefertiti ruled for a short stint in between. But Tutankhamun left us this inscription in which he tells about restoring Egypt, reopening the temples. His later successor, Horemheb, talks about hiring back priests and getting things back to normal. In other words, the goal of Tutankhamun, by the way, he changed his name. He was born Tutankhaten, the living image of Aten, and he changed his name to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. So we can say that Tutankhamun's greatest contribution was to make Amun great again. So, I believe then that each religion was based on its own theophany. Moses had his burning bush encounter with God, and that stands at the basis of the beginning of the Mosaic religion, if you will. And whatever encounter Akhenaten had with the sun that we read about in the 10th pylon inscriptions or the boundary stela, both had their own encounters with deity, and there's something fundamentally different. I think when you have a theophany and a religion follows, there are several things you need to make it last. Number one, you have to have a charismatic leader. There has to be a body of literature, and there have to be followers to carry it on. As far as we know, with Akhenaten, when he died, the literature that was carved on the temple walls stayed there. We have no copies of later texts. Classic Egyptian literature is copied again and again and again over the years on papyri and other sources. We have no additional copies of those inscriptions that really are his theological manifesto, except on the walls of those tombs, and they were all abandoned. So they each had his own theophany, and I might conclude by saying that Moses was still the first person with a tablet to download data from a cloud. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a treat, and taken us a little bit to the side of where we would normally have gone, which makes it all the more special. I could never have done that. We've got not much time for questions because lunch is about to begin, and I didn't bind you to questions anyway, I don't think. But probably we've got time for 2 quick questions if there are any. I've got plenty, but I can ask later. Yeah.
Do you have any indication why he looks so different to the other?
Yeah, what happened? Had only a face a mother could love. Yeah, we really don't know. Many have thought there were genetic issues. The DNA studies that were done on the mummies of several family members, like his father, his mother, there is a mummy that was found in Tomb 55 in the Valley of the Kings, which may be his mummy. It's not labeled. It could be his body, or traditionally was thought to be that of a son of his. But that mummy and those don't suggest any of the sort of genetic disorders like Marfan syndrome, Fragile X chromosome. So if those tests are valid, and some question them because the DNA was taken from the long bones, legs, and I've been told by some that long bones are not the best place to do DNA. Teeth are the best place because you can't contaminate the inside the enamel, whereas other parts of a body are more easily contaminated. So maybe there's a DNA a genetic thing, but most now think if that is valid, then it must be some stylistic religious motif, because he goes from looking very normal to very weird.
Thank you. We'll probably call it a day for the sake of our kitchen staff, but please join me thanking Professor Hoffmeier. Lunch awaits. Thank you very much.